Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a past where humanity teetered on the brink. Not from cosmic catastrophes or fantastical beasts, but from the quiet catastrophe of its own confidence. So before we get too comfortable, maybe pause, settle in, dim the lights, and take a breath. Because what follows is a walk through decisions so disastrously earnest they nearly undid us all. If history had a customer satisfaction survey, the Middle Ages might have scored poorly, but not from lack of trying. No, medieval people tried with a sincerity so absolute that the results became tragic and, in some places, nearly terminal. In that strange in-between space of fading empires and rising kingdoms, where superstition jostled uneasily with inherited classical wisdom, a single idea took root and flourished like a weed. If the body faltered, it must be purged. The solution was as visceral as it was misguided: bleed the sickness out. Physicians, clergy, and all those who carried the mantle of learned authority looked to the ancient texts, not for innovation, but affirmation. And what they found there was humoral theory, the idea that health came from balance among four invisible substances within the body. If that balance tipped, illness followed. The fix? Open a vein. It's hard to overstate the fervor with which this belief was applied. A man with fever lost blood. A woman with a cough, also blood. Even melancholy, that quiet ache of the soul, was treated with leeches and lancets. Suffering wasn't just endured, it was orchestrated. A doctor's blade sliced not only the flesh but into the very trust that patients had in their own survival. And when the patient collapsed, pale and breathless, this was considered evidence that the process was working. Fainting wasn't a warning sign, it was progress. Doctors who resisted this practice were viewed with suspicion. What good was a healer who left a body uncut, unpurged, still swollen with corrupted fluid? To refuse bloodletting was to court death by negligence, or so it seemed. And as plagues swept through villages, towns, and walled cities, the practice intensified. The weaker the body, the more urgently it needed to be drained. The dying were opened like wine casks, their life spilling out in the name of balance. This wasn't quackery on the fringes, it was mainstream, state-of-the-art. Even as patients perished under their care, practitioners remained confident. If the bleeding didn't help, the answer was simple. Not enough had been taken. No matter the symptom, the method was constant, and when communities buried their dead, they buried them not only with grief, but with the unshaken belief that the treatment had been right. The failure, if there was one, lay with the body. The logic, terrifying in its circularity, preserved itself through faith alone. But medicine wasn't the only field where conviction courted disaster. As hunger clawed at Europe's door and famine became an unwelcome but frequent guest, another series of choices took hold. Authorities, eager to protect the moral and physical well-being of their people, began to warn against the consumption of moisture, especially in the form of fruits and vegetables. It wasn't rot they feared. It was the idea that these foods corrupted the body's sacred humors. Apples, raw greens, fresh anything, these were deemed dangerous. Too moist, too untrustworthy to be eaten during crisis. Instead, people were urged toward dryness. Stale bread, thick porridge, salted meats, and heavily fermented drinks like wine were the approved path. This advice might have seemed harmless had it not coincided with widespread scarcity. While the wealthy could stock their larders with dense, dry sustenance, the poor found themselves in a cruel paradox. The only available foods, the ones growing wild in fields or hidden in gardens, were the very ones they were told to avoid. So they obeyed. Or tried. Even when their stomachs begged for relief, fear spoke louder than hunger. The results were predictable. Malnourished and cold, many withered not from lack of access, but from the rules surrounding that access. Children stopped growing, elders weakened, adults lost strength to labor. And as diseases passed through villages already reeling from hunger, they found no resistance. The body cannot defend what it has already surrendered. Immune systems collapsed like brittle walls, breached by every passing infection. And yet, when people worsened, the response was not to reevaluate. Instead, the fast was tightened. Some physicians claimed that even digesting food was a threat to healing, that the body must remain focused on purging illness rather than breaking bread. So meals shrank further. In some cases, they vanished altogether. Entire families abstained, waiting for divine mercy or medical absolution that never came. The young perished first, their growing bones halted mid-formation. Then came the old, too frail to carry their own weight. To suffer was to be purified. To starve was, in some circles, seen as evidence of spiritual strength. Hunger wasn't merely a tragedy. It was reframed as a moral trial. And when someone died of it, perhaps they had passed the test, or failed it. Either way, the logic held, the rules stayed. And still, somehow, people survived, not because of the advice they followed, but despite it. They clung to life not through reason, but resilience. In the darkest winters, in the hungriest years, the will to endure remained, quiet, stubborn, and unspectacular. In the heart of medieval towns, survival was often a matter of collective habit, not conscious strategy. Daily life unfolded within narrow lanes and teetering buildings, not because people loved congestion, but because walls were safety. Every stone had been laid with the hope that it might keep something, invaders, wolves, hunger, on the outside. Yet what festered inside those walls posed a far more insidious threat. Waste, in all its forms, was handled with a peculiar optimism. Once discarded, it ceased to be a problem. Refuse, rot, excrement, these were cast into alleys, into gutters, or directly into rivers, with the unspoken belief that water was a kind of eraser. The logic was ancient, intuitive, and catastrophically wrong. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria, but they understood flow. If the stream ran swift, then surely what went into it upstream would be gone by the time it reached downstream mouths. Unfortunately, the rivers were not so cooperative. The same water that carried away filth returned, unchanged in essence, to be drawn up for drinking, cooking, brewing. Latrines were built above waterways. Tanners soaked animal hides in the same currents that fed household wells. Slaughterhouses spilled blood and entrails into creeks that whispered past kitchens. Laundry was washed in a toxic soup of other people's secrets, and every bucket dipped brought disease closer. But the water looked clean. It shimmered in the sun. It whispered no warnings. So when illness spread, blame did not follow the flow of rivers. It climbed into the stars, settled on the wind, or rooted itself in the souls of strangers. Bad air, bad omens, foreigners, cats, everything but the obvious. Medieval people responded as best they knew how, with incense, with bells, with prayers, with flight. They fled cities in panicked waves, unwittingly carrying the plague with them into fresh corners of the countryside. In their wake, the water remained, invisible, unchanged, faithful to the pattern. What's remarkable is that even without microscopes or modern science, people noticed patterns. They saw that some neighborhoods sickened more than others, that some wells seemed cursed. But lacking a framework to name the cause, they shaped their fear around ideas of morality and divine punishment. If sickness followed a household, perhaps it had done something wrong. If a district fell ill, perhaps its air was cursed. Even when the clues stacked high as rooftops, the rivers kept flowing, and no one thought to intervene. The situation grew darker when another suspect crept into public imagination, the cat. Silent, self-contained, moving through shadows and often keeping its own company, the cat had long been an object of suspicion in a world that prized obedience and visibility. And when plague struck with a fury, no leech or prayer could slow. The people needed a scapegoat. Cats, with their eerie eyes and inexplicable aloofness, were perfectly poised to inherit that role. Their association with witches and darkness was centuries old, a whisper in the margins of religious texts and folk tales. Now, fear made it law. Communities turned on them with sudden violence. Cats were hunted, killed, or driven out, their presence rewritten from companion to curse. Entire villages cleansed themselves of these creatures with fire and sword, believing they were banishing disease. But nature does not always respond to moral fervor. The rats came next, and they came fast. Without their ancient predators, rodents multiplied in the shadows, behind ovens, beneath beds, inside the sacks of grain that barely sustained the hungry. With them came fleas, and with the fleas, a bacterium that history would come to know intimately. And still, no one noticed the connection. The dying intensified, and so did the killings. If cats had failed to stop the plague, perhaps there simply hadn't been enough of them eliminated. The reasoning fed itself. Even dogs were caught in the purge, caught up in a fog of fear that did not distinguish between logic and suspicion. The actual agents of death, rats, fleas, unclean water, crowded rooms, continued unchallenged. In the absence of understanding, what mattered most was action. Doing something, anything, felt better than helplessness. And into this storm of terror marched the flagellants. Shirtless, shoeless, often bloodied by their own hands, they roamed from town to town in solemn parades of self-punishment. Believing the plague to be a judgment from above, they offered their pain as proof of repentance. Whips lashed bare backs in public squares. Voices lifted in chants that blurred grief with ecstasy. Onlookers wept, joined, or fled, yet always watched. Wherever they went, the disease followed, unnoticed. They brought not salvation, but contagion. In towns where the plague had not yet arrived, the flagellants' processions sometimes marked its beginning. They mingled with the sick, embraced the grieving, shared not only penance but pathogens. The movement gained momentum, fed by despair and the deep medieval craving for meaning. Suffering had to mean something. Pain had to speak. And when institutions faltered, churches, governments, even healers, pain became the loudest voice in the room. Authorities struggled to respond. Some church leaders tried to stop the flagellants, but found their own authority eclipsed by these men of blood and song. For every voice calling for restraint, a dozen others shouted for purification through agony. And so the march continued, through fields, across bridges, into marketplaces, and through the doors of homes already heavy with grief. They came, bleeding, singing, believing. The plague moved with them. To modernize, it reads as madness, but to those who lived it, it was faith in motion. In the face of unstoppable death, movement was life. Stillness was surrender. Within the stone walls of medieval cities, human life pulsed at a frequency few today could tolerate. Streets folded into each other like cramped pages in a book too often read. Homes rose precariously, pressed shoulder to shoulder as if huddling for warmth. The idea of personal space was foreign, a luxury born centuries later. Instead, people stacked themselves in layers, families above families, livestock below, soot everywhere. Smoke, the silent tenant of every household, threaded through rafters, settled on skin, and filled lungs long before daylight did. These were cities built not for comfort, but for closeness. Every inch of space within the protective ring of city walls was precious. Land was expensive. So instead of expanding, people ascended. Buildings climbed upward, crooked and creaking, like stone trees desperate for sunlight. Inside, entire generations shared rooms, sometimes even beds. Chickens pecked at crumbs beneath kitchen tables. Pigs, not pets but possessions, wandered through alleys as if they owned the lease. And above it all, chamber pots waited on windowsills, ready to deliver their contents to the street below with a shouted warning, or sometimes none at all. Waste flowed downward, and rain was expected to clean what society would not. The result was a mixture of resilience and rot, a habitat where disease didn't just spread, it thrived. One cough echoed between stone walls, finding 10 ears and 10 sets of lungs before fading. One sneeze could trigger a household collapse, and when plague entered the gates, it didn't knock. It burst in like fire, consuming block after block before anyone understood what was happening. Still, isolation was rare, not from lack of care, but because the idea of separation felt unnatural. If someone fell ill, the instinct was to draw near, not away. Family crowded the bedside not in ignorance, but in love. A sick child was held tighter, a fevered spouse embraced, a dying parent surrounded by kin whispering prayers and memories. To withdraw would have felt inhuman, to abandon would have felt damning. Even the church hesitated to preach distance. The soul needed comfort, even as the body deteriorated. And so the disease found fertile ground, not just in the filth or the food or the air, but in the compassion itself. Illness passed hand to hand, heart to heart, because medieval people refused to isolate. They didn't believe in a salvation that required solitude. Even physicians rarely recommended distance. Some insisted that cheerful company might lift the patient's spirits and thus help healing. Perhaps it did, briefly. But germs do not care about morale. Even the structures conspired against survival. Windows, if present at all, were narrow slits made more for defense than light. Homes were dim, the air stagnant, thick with smoke from open hearths and the sweat of too many bodies in too little space. Fires burned year-round, choking the air with particles no one had the language to fear. The lungs, already battered by daily life, became perfect landing zones for illness. Breath was shallow. Coughs were common. Death, when it came, often began in the chest. Outside, city life offered no refuge. During times of war or famine, the desperate flooded in from the countryside, pressing into towns already bursting at the seams. Refugees didn't find peace. They found crowding, hunger, and the sharp edge of urban mortality. The very walls that kept invaders out also kept disease in. Cities became pressure chambers, and when they burst, the consequences were devastating. Yet even as death stalked the streets, the human instinct clung to hope. Hope that cleanliness was a matter of incense, that suffering was penance, that if the wicked were punished, the righteous might be spared. And when those hopes failed, suspicion grew like mold. Someone had to be blamed. If not the stars, then the sinners. If not the air, then the people who breathed it differently. Witches, foreigners, widows, herbalists. Anyone who stood slightly apart became suspect. The plague may have been invisible, but its targets became increasingly visible. Fear lit torches. Crowds gathered, accusations erupted like fever. A woman who lived alone, who knew the names of herbs, who had a cat or a scar or simply a strange accent, could find herself dragged before a jury of her terrified neighbors. The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Eliminate the evil, and the illness will vanish with it. It did not. But that didn't stop the fires from being lit. Trials were held with more urgency than fairness. Confessions extracted under threat or torment were paraded as proof. The plague, meanwhile, watched with indifference, moving from home to home, carried not by witches, but by rats and air and touch and silence. Every new outbreak validated the violence. If people continued to die, clearly the community had not cleansed itself thoroughly enough. More suspects were found. More executions were staged, and with each death, righteous or otherwise, the disease crept deeper, quieter and more inevitable. The streets filled with whispers, the jails filled with the accused, the air filled with a tension that had nothing to do with infection and everything to do with fear. It was a cycle of tragedy wrapped in the illusion of control. The belief that chaos could be tamed by punishment, that God's anger could be redirected through fire and accusation. But disease does not listen to prayers, and fear does not obey reason. In trying to exorcise the plague, humanity exiled its own healers, its caretakers, its wise women and midwives, those who had, for generations, been the only line of defense when real medicine failed. The consequences lingered for centuries. Silence replaced wisdom, shame replaced knowledge, and illness spread in the space where help used to live. As the plague swept across the land, and the fires of persecution flickered in city squares, another strategy emerged, one that carried the same misplaced confidence, but with a different scent. Poison. Not poison in the malicious sense, but in the medicinal. Doctors, having failed to save lives with bloodletting, fasting, and spiritual purification, turned instead to a new arsenal of substances, one so toxic they made illness itself look merciful by comparison. Mercury was a favorite. It shimmered like liquid metal, mysterious and mesmerizing, pulled from the earth like a sacred treasure. That it burned the flesh, wrecked the nerves, and hollowed out the mind seemed almost beside the point. If the disease was powerful, the cure had to be stronger. Suffering during treatment wasn't a red flag. It was a requirement. The body had to be purged, and if that purging left the patient writhing in fever, gasping from cramps or seeping from every orifice, then perhaps it was a sign that the medicine was working, and Mercury was not alone. Arsenic made appearances too, as did lead. Quiet killers given in measured doses, each one a gamble. They were administered as powders, dissolved into wine or packed into pills of crushed minerals and wishful thinking. A person already weakened by hunger and fear might now be asked to swallow a draught that scorched from the inside out. If they lived, credit went to the cure. If they died, the illness was simply too far gone. There were no safety protocols, there was no standard dose. Remedies were as much improvisation as tradition. The line between treatment and execution blurred, and patients became test subjects in a silent war against the unknown. Yet these cures did not come from charlatans alone. Monks prescribed them. Scholars copied the recipes. Respected physicians handed them to desperate families with steady hands. These weren't back-alley solutions. They were endorsed, official, even sanctified. Lead seeped into cookware, into water pipes, into cosmetics. Women dabbed it on their faces to pale their skin, unaware that the very image of health and beauty was slowly poisoning them. Wine was sweetened with lead compounds to mask the sourness of spoilage. Cups of celebration became quiet, cumulative executions. Generations lived in a fog of chronic exposure, their tremors and madness explained away as divine punishment, melancholy, or weakness of the soul. In this landscape of suffering, intention mattered more than results. If the doctor meant well, his failure was forgiven. If the treatment was prescribed by a man in robes or university-trained physician, its deadliness was assumed to be part of its power. And so poisons multiplied, layered one upon another like the ingredients in some malevolent recipe. A man might be given arsenic in the morning and mercury by nightfall, vomiting, sweating, collapsing in agony. These were signs of healing, or so everyone hoped. This blind trust extended beyond medicine. When death outpaced the grave diggers, when the bodies stacked higher than the altars, society itself began to stagger under the weight. Cemeteries overflowed. The rituals of burial, once so sacred, so carefully attended, gave way to necessity. Coffins were abandoned. Prayers were whispered hastily. The dead were not laid to rest with reverence, but with urgency. Mass graves opened like wounds outside city walls. Shallow, hasty, sometimes dug too close to wells or rivers. The bodies came faster than the earth could receive them. Families kept corpses at home for days, waiting for help, waiting for someone strong enough or brave enough to carry them away. The stench grew thick, clinging to walls and skin. Insects gathered, animals prowled, and the disease, never far, fed on the decay. The air in some towns became so heavy with rot that people carried herbs in their sleeves, pressed to their faces like fragile armor. Officials tried to send out carts to collect the dead, their approach heralded by a grim call. Bring out your dead. People complied silently, too exhausted to mourn, too numb to protest. Death became a routine, as regular as sunrise, as impersonal as rain. What disturbed many was not the cruelty of it all, but the inevitability. No one had the energy to ask why things had reached this point. Few dared suggest alternatives. Even fewer were listened to. Death had become so normal that change itself seemed irrelevant. This is how it had to be. This is what survival looked like now, stepping around the dead on your way to fetch water, covering your mouth with cloth that barely filtered the scent of collapse, waiting for illness to pass through your door, hoping it would spare someone, anyone. And amidst it all, another observation began to settle into collective awareness. One so obvious it almost went unnoticed. When one person became sick, others followed, not just occasionally, but consistently. Illness moved from body to body, household to household. Yet the conclusion most people drew was not that separation might help, but that closeness was even more necessary. To leave someone alone in their suffering felt cruel, even sinful. To refuse a final embrace, to stay distant while a loved one moaned in pain, that was not compassion, that was abandonment. And so the cycle deepened. The sick were comforted, kissed, held. They coughed into the same air their children breathed. Their fever-slick hands were gripped by those trying to help. The effort was beautiful. The result, devastating. Even in towns where people had begun to understand that proximity brought danger, resistance remained. Some tried to enforce quarantine, to isolate travelers, to detain the infected. But rules frayed quickly. A merchant bribed his way past. A mother snuck in to see her son. A priest defied orders to offer last rites. Love and duty moved faster than caution, and the sickness kept pace. Sometimes entire cities tried to close their gates to newcomers. But fear, desperation, and religious obligation opened cracks in even the strictest defenses. And when the plague entered, it entered completely. Beyond the cities, in the fields and forests, hunger lay coiled like a second plague. Quieter, slower, but just as fatal. Unlike the surging terror of illness, famine moved with a certain patience. It did not strike so much as seep. It arrived not in a moment, but over seasons. First as a failed harvest, then as spoiled grain, then as rumors in the marketplace that bread was thinner, that meat had vanished, that no one could afford to eat the way they used to. Most people in medieval Europe lived in a state of permanent nutritional deficit. They were not starving visibly, dramatically, but starving in a quieter, almost invisible way. Their meals were repetitive, seasonal, and thin. Bread was the foundation of their diet, dense, dry, often hard enough to wound a tooth. Vegetables were seasonal luxuries, meat rarer still, reserved for feast days or moments when an animal died of accident or age. This constant edge of hunger didn't kill outright, but it wore people down. Children grew smaller, bones became fragile, bodies aged too quickly. The immune system, that unseen army within, operated with only half its soldiers. People could survive on such rations, but only until something else pushed them over. And something always did. The bad years came as they always had. Heavy rains drowned the crops. Frost came early and stayed long. Wars broke out, burning the fields. Grain reserves, never ample, ran out. And then famine wasn't just the quiet ache of insufficiency. It was the loud, clawing scream of absolute lack. In these moments, survival became political. Markets tightened, hoarding began, prices soared. Those with coin could still eat, those without began to barter, to beg, to starve in full view of those who were merely thinning. It wasn't always the absence of food that killed, it was the collapse of access. There were villages where bread was baked behind locked doors, while children died in the road just outside. But even then, hunger was framed not as a failure of governance or distribution, but as a test, a spiritual trial, a divine judgment. And those who starved, they were not considered victims of mismanagement, but sometimes sinners unworthy of mercy, or saints being tested beyond endurance. Instructions about what to eat during famine were sometimes absurd. Religious authorities and physicians advised against eating certain foods, not because they were spoiled or unsafe, but because they were moist, and moisture, according to the theory of humors, threatened the body's balance. Fresh fruit and raw greens, often the only food available, were treated with suspicion. Instead, people were encouraged to seek dry foods. Stale bread, dried meat, thickened porridge, foods they could not afford or find. So the hungry obeyed, or tried to. They refused apples even as they rotted at their feet. They passed over wild greens that grew along the roadside. They ignored the mushrooms and berries that might have saved them. They followed advice given by men who had never gone without. They chose piety over nourishment and died with clean humors and empty stomachs. Those who did eat often found little relief. Heavy foods required energy to digest, energy a weakened body didn't have. Starvation isn't just about intake, it's about absorption. A meal, when finally secured, might not save you. It might overwhelm your already collapsing system. The body, so long denied, sometimes forgot how to accept what it had once known. Children bore the weight most cruelly. They shrank from within. Their bones stopped growing, their eyes dulled. And when sickness came, as it always did, their bodies had no reserves left to fight. Disease didn't have to try hard. It simply arrived, and the malnourished surrendered. Generations were lost, not in battles, but in kitchens with nothing on the fire. Even in recovery, famine left scars. Villages depopulated. Laborers vanished. Parents buried children and then forgot how to speak. And just as the land began to yield again, new threats appeared in the distance. Armies on the march. Medieval warfare wasn't sudden or swift. It moved slowly, dragged out over years, and destroyed not just enemies, but environments. The armies didn't simply pass through. They consumed. They trampled crops, seized livestock, poisoned wells, burned granaries. The war wasn't always about conquest. Sometimes it was about starvation as strategy. The peasants caught between rival factions were not soldiers, but targets. Their homes became battlegrounds. Their fields became ash. Their choices were reduced to three: flee, hide, or perish. And even when they escaped the sword, they rarely escaped the consequences. The destruction of one season could mean years of hunger. Tools lost, seed grain eaten, land left fallow out of fear. And wherever armies went, disease followed. Soldiers lived close, traveled constantly, and carried sickness with them like an invisible standard. When they arrived in a town, they didn't just bring swords, they brought contagion. When they left, the fever stayed. The countryside emptied into cities. Refugees poured into already crumbling urban centers, looking for protection and finding only more mouths, more bodies, more disease. Cities groaned under the weight. Food lines stretched, sanitation collapsed. The plague found fertile ground again, not because of a single cause, but because every part of the system failed at once. And even when peace came, When the kings signed treaties, when the armies disbanded, the land did not heal quickly. Recovery was slow. Seeds had to be found. Trust rebuilt. The men who knew how to work the soil were sometimes already buried in it. Worse still, wars didn't come just once. They repeated. One generation might see 3, 4, 5 separate conflicts. A border dispute, a noble feud, a crusade. Peace was a pause, not a destination, and in between those pauses, fields lay in ruin, and the people learned to live with the sound of hooves and the smell of smoke. This was the backdrop of life for many medieval people. Not the dramatic clash of knights and banners, but the slow erosion of stability. The knowledge that even if you survived one disaster, another would soon arrive to try again. Survival became its own kind of resistance, not through brilliance or design, but through sheer endurance. Families planted again, rebuilt again, hoped again. Not because they believed things would improve, but because doing anything else meant surrendering entirely. And despite everything, they did not surrender. Even within the supposed shelter of home, danger was rarely absent. The very act of staying warm, of surviving winter's breath, came with a cost that no one fully understood, until their lungs began to betray them. Fire, essential and sacred, burned in the center of every dwelling. It roasted food, warded off frost, lit the dark, but it also exhaled a slow, silent poison. Chimneys were scarce. Ventilation was an afterthought, if it was a thought at all. Smoke gathered where the heat lived, under thatch, between beams, around the faces of sleeping children. It clung to blankets and hair and eyes, a constant companion. It seemed ordinary because it had always been there. People did not fear it because they had no memory of a world without it. What was normal did not seem dangerous, but the damage accumulated. Coughs deepened, breathing grew shallow. The lungs, already burdened by malnutrition and disease, now labored against the weight of soot and ash. Children developed wheezes before they learned to walk. Elders rasped through their last winters in a haze of breathlessness. And when sickness came, especially those that clung to the chest, it entered a body already compromised. Ironically, some believed the smoke was protective. It was thought to purify the air, to drive out evil spirits or bad humors. More fires were lit during plagues, more incense burned, more smoky prayers lifted into blackened rafters. But what it chased away spiritually, it invited physically. If disease didn't kill, the atmosphere might. And yet, the alternative, cold, was worse. Cold came swiftly and killed without ceremony. A single night without warmth could undo an entire family. So the fires stayed, and the smoke remained. Generations were raised beneath rafters stained with their own breath. When air became invisible danger, water was no safer. Despite the growing awareness that some places sickened more than others, that certain streams carried ruin, the medieval mind could not yet see the connection. Wells were dug near graveyards. Rivers doubled as toilets, sewers, laundries, and breweries. Water passed through the hands of the dying and was lifted again to the lips of the living, and still there was no break in routine. Reflection, if it happened, didn't lead to change. The knowledge was there, just beneath the surface, but there was no structure to hold it. No system to test an idea, to track a cause, just observation, unanchored and easily ignored. In this void, tradition ruled. And tradition, for all its familiarity, often killed. People followed old remedies because they were old. Advice was copied not because it had worked, but because it had always been given. Medical texts repeated the same mistakes for centuries. Their words passed like sacred scripture across generations of students too reverent to question them. The authority of the past was ironclad. Galen, Hippocrates, Aristotle. The names echoed louder than any living voice. If they said bloodletting worked, then it did, no matter how many died. If they warned against certain foods or praised certain cures, those teachings were followed, even when they conflicted with what people saw with their own eyes. To doubt tradition was to flirt with arrogance, and arrogance, in a religious world, was more dangerous than disease. A physician who deviated risked not just professional ruin, but moral condemnation. Innovation was not seen as bravery, but as heresy. Observation without permission meant nothing. So people watched the same treatments fail again and again. They noticed that patients bled often died faster. They saw that towns using one well suffered more. They realized, quietly, that some actions made things worse. But these thoughts remained private, buried under the weight of custom. A few brave souls dared to try differently, but even they moved cautiously, changing things only when the consequences of staying the same became unbearable. Progress was not declared, it was whispered. It entered households in the form of small deviations, minor adjustments, personal habits that defied the manuals. And when these changes worked, they were not celebrated, they were hidden. Because to improve was to suggest that what came before was wrong. And medieval society had staked its survival on the belief that the old ways were sacred, that the wisdom of ancestors, no matter how flawed, was better than the chaos of questioning. This wasn't ignorance, it was certainty, the kind that hardens over time until it becomes a cage so familiar that no one sees the bars anymore, and yet, against all odds, people endured. Not because their systems were sound, but because their need to live burned stronger than their need to understand. They made it through the centuries not by mastering the world, but by adapting in spite of themselves. The deeper one looks into the medieval world, the more staggering it becomes, not because of how little people knew, but how fiercely they held on to what they thought they knew. There was no shortage of explanations, only a shortage of correction. Beliefs hardened into law. Ideas passed down became anchors, not ladders. And nowhere was this more evident than in how humanity treated its oldest allies. Cats, once keepers of granaries and guardians of grain, became pariahs. Their silence, their independence, their unblinking eyes, all of it conspired against them in a world desperate for scapegoats. Superstition filled the space where science should have stood. Disease needed a face. Cats offered one. They were burned, drowned, driven out. Not because they failed, but because their nature defied easy understanding. People could not tolerate what they could not control, and so, in an act of almost poetic misjudgment, the very creature that might have slowed the spread of plague was eliminated at the exact moment it was needed most. The rats watched from the shadows, emboldened, and it wasn't just animals or healers or strangers that fell victim to humanity's fear. Eventually, the fear turned inward. As illness spread and explanations failed, a chilling logic took hold. Perhaps the disease wasn't just a test, it was punishment. And if it was punishment, perhaps it could be avoided through suffering. Enter the flagellants. Their processions were not gentle displays of repentance, but brutal spectacles of self-harm. They marched half-naked, chained and bleeding, across villages already weakened by hunger and sickness. They sang, they wept, they lashed themselves open for all to see, hoping that if God noticed enough pain, he might relent. They were not isolated events. They were performances. Crowds gathered. Sick joined the healthy. The processions moved like rivers through town after town, leaving behind trails of blood, breath, and plague. No one had considered that devotion might be contagious, not spiritually, but physically. Doctors tried to intervene. Priests issued condemnations. But the movement had taken root not in policy, but in emotion. Pain was action, and inaction in the face of so much death felt like complicity. The flagellants didn't trust science, what little of it there was. They didn't trust clergy or nobles, or even the sick themselves. They trusted pain. Pain, at least, felt honest. When everything else was collapsing, to suffer publicly was to regain a sense of control. And in many ways, this was the heart of the medieval struggle. Control in the face of chaos. The illusion of understanding in a world that refused to be understood. Cities tried to impose order with walls. Doctors tried to impose healing with blades. Families tried to impose care with closeness. Authorities tried to impose morality with executions. But the disease moved through it all, unseen, untouched, unimpressed. Even after centuries of calamity, the systems that failed were rarely dismantled. They were reinforced, rewritten, repeated. When water made people sick, the wells were blessed. When food vanished, the poor were told to fast. When healers saved lives through knowledge, they were accused of heresy. When children died, it was framed as a spiritual release. Progress did not come from consensus. It came from exhaustion, from the slow, grinding collapse of certainty. Change emerged in the quiet spaces when a midwife decided not to bleed her patient, when a father risked feeding his children the forbidden fruit, when a town secretly began boiling its water because it felt safer, even if no scripture said so. And still, despite the odds, humanity persisted, not because of the systems in place, but in defiance of them. Because somewhere between famine and fire, plague and prayer, people kept doing what they'd always done, burying the dead, planting again, finding warmth, seeking answers. They endured, not because they understood the world, but because they refused to vanish from it. For all their reverence toward tradition, medieval people were not blind. They saw patterns, they noticed suffering, they understood that something was deeply wrong, if not in the heavens, then at least in the streets, in the homes, in the quiet places where children no longer played. And at some point, that awareness began to wear against their patience. Slowly, almost invisibly, the old practices began to weaken under the weight of repetition and death. Someone, somewhere, stopped bleeding their patience. Not because a better explanation had been found, but because the outcomes were too terrible to ignore. Someone else began boiling water, not from scientific knowledge, but because the alternative smelled like rot and tasted worse. A village experimented with keeping the sick apart just for a while, and discovered, with quiet awe, that the disease didn't spread as quickly. These were not revolutions. They were improvisations. Small, scattered, often undocumented. They did not announce themselves with fanfare. They crept in sideways, carried by necessity rather than theory. And they stayed, not because they were praised, but because they worked. Humanity began to shift, not all at once, and not even intentionally. The same minds that had trusted leeches and purges began to notice when their neighbors survived without them. And rather than rewriting the books, they simply stopped following them so closely. The great medical texts remained on shelves, revered and recited, but their grip loosened, their instructions softened. Progress was quiet, uneven, and largely accidental. The changes that mattered most did not come from kings or councils. They came from midwives who kept better records than priests, from barbers who stopped cutting veins when too many of their clients didn't return, from women who shared herbs over fences, despite being told not to. This wasn't enlightenment, it was adaptation under pressure, a kind of learning by attrition. When a method failed enough times to threaten entire communities, people found ways, however small, however subtle, to abandon it. But these shifts were not always welcomed. Being right too soon was dangerous. A healer with too much success might draw attention, and not the good kind. To deviate from accepted wisdom was to risk everything, reputation, livelihood, even freedom. And so, many early innovators learned to conceal their progress beneath the familiar. They gave old names to new practices. They cloaked insight in humility. They survived by pretending not to know what they knew. Because the real enemy was not ignorance, it was certainty. Medieval people were not fools. They were humans caught in a system that punished doubt and rewarded obedience. They were survivors of inherited ideas that no longer served them, but which still held power over them. Ideas that had once offered order and meaning, but had calcified into something rigid and dangerous. And perhaps the greatest danger of all was that these ideas felt safe. The world, to them, was not chaotic. It was structured, explainable, governed by divine will and cosmic balance. The blood must be let because it had always been let. The child must fast during illness because fasting was pious. The water was clean because God had made it so. To challenge any of this wasn't just unwise, it was sacrilegious. It took centuries of failure for this certainty to loosen. And even then, it resisted. Improvements didn't erase the past. They grew beside it, in tension with it, often in secret. The old ideas weren't defeated. They were simply outlived. And what remains most astonishing is that despite all of this, despite the bad advice, the poisoned cures, the burning of allies, and the endless recycling of mistakes, humanity endured. Not by design, but by sheer, obstinate momentum. People kept being born, kept planting, kept burying, kept searching for something better. They survived, not because their systems worked, but because eventually those systems stopped being able to hide their failure. If you were to step into the medieval world and ask someone what kept the cosmos together, they would not point to science or order. They would point to something older, something sacred. In Norse lands, that something was Yggdrasil, the great tree of existence. Not a metaphor, not a poetic symbol, but the actual, central axis of reality. Its roots plunged into the unknowable. Its branches held the heavens. Every world, of gods, of humans, of giants, and of death, hung somewhere along its limbs like ripe, fragile fruit. The Vikings did not see the universe as a place of stability. They saw it as something barely held together and constantly under siege. Yggdrasil was not serene. It creaked under the strain of time. It bled sap. Creatures gnawed at its roots. Birds whispered news from its crown. The tree was alive, but it was also dying. Slowly, inevitably. At the base of the tree lay the wells, mystic pools of fate, wisdom, and memory. Their waters fed the roots, but they also exacted a cost. One did not drink from them freely. One sacrificed for understanding. Even Odin, the high god, was forced to give something to know more, his eye. And still, knowledge did not bring peace. It brought clarity, and clarity, for the gods, was a sentence more binding than chains. The Norse gods lived not as eternal, untouchable beings, but as actors in a tragedy already underway. They could feast and laugh and wage war, but always under the shadow of an ending they could not escape. They were not symbols of perfection. They were beings of responsibility. Odin sought wisdom not to comfort his people, but to prepare for doom. Thor swung his hammer not to dominate, but to hold back the chaos for one more season. And chaos had a shape. It lived in Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, forces of nature unbound by civility. The giants were not evil. They were necessary. They were the avalanche, the wildfire, the drought. They reminded the gods that order was a task, not a state. Humans, too, lived on Yggdrasil. In Midgard, a world surrounded by ocean and circled by a serpent so vast that it could bite its own tail, they built homes, fought battles, raised children, and tried to matter. But their place in the cosmos was not secure. It was a balance, a temporary one. Midgard could be breached, monsters crossed boundaries, giants wandered into the worlds of men, and the dead, on occasion, did not stay where they were buried. This worldview bred a certain kind of courage. If the world could end at any moment, then fear was a waste of time. What mattered was how you faced the inevitable. What mattered was whether you stood or fled when the serpent stirred, or the winter bit too deeply, or the gods called upon mortals to take up arms for a doomed defense. And at the heart of all this stood Odin, not a god of comfort, but of sacrifice and sorrow. He knew more than any being alive, and that was his burden. He saw how everything ended. He knew that the gods would fall, that Yggdrasil would burn, that the skies would darken and the sea rise to swallow the land. And still, he prepared. He hung himself from the world tree, pierced by his own spear, to snatch the runes from death. He gave not just blood, but agony, to gain the knowledge no other dared seek. And even after all that, he did not achieve victory. He achieved readiness. The Norse cosmos did not promise fairness. It promised struggle. Even the gods could die. Even order could collapse. The point was never safety. It was resolve. To live in such a world was to understand that fragility was built into existence itself. Nothing was forever. Not joy, not peace. Not even the gods who shaped the sky. The only permanence was the fight to endure. And somehow, in the face of that truth, the Vikings found meaning. Not because they believed they would win, but because they believed it mattered to try. In the Norse world, fate was not a fog to be wandered through. It was a thread, firm, unbroken, and already woven. At the root of Yggdrasil, in the shadowed soil beneath all the worlds, sat the Norns. They did not rule as gods did. They did not punish or bless, they simply carved. One shaped what had been, one shaped what was, and one shaped what would come. Even the gods feared their hands, for the Norns did not answer prayers. They recorded reality. To the Vikings, this was not despairing. It was clarifying. If your death was written before your birth, then what mattered wasn't how to avoid it, but how to meet it. Fear lost its teeth when the outcome was inevitable. What remained was choice. And that choice defined you more than any prophecy could. A warrior's death was not a tragedy. It was an opportunity. To fall in battle, to die not with a whimper but with defiance, meant something more than mere survival. It meant that your name would linger, not just in memory, but in myth. In this way, death was not the end of meaning. It was its proving ground. The battlefield was not a place of chaos, it was a stage, and the warriors who died with courage were not lost. They were chosen, carried to Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where death itself became preparation. Every day, the dead fought again, not as punishment, but as training. They died and rose, not for themselves, but for a final war they knew they could not win. Valhalla was not heaven. It was duty extended beyond the grave, and not all who fell in battle went there. Freyja claimed half. They went to Folkvanga, her domain, less known, less described, but no less honored. Death, even among heroes, was divided. There was no single afterlife. There were paths, all shaped by how you lived and how you met your end. Those who did not die with sword in hand found a different road. They went to hell, not a place of torment, but of silence. A cold, grey realm where those who died of age, illness, or accident waited out eternity. They were not condemned, they were simply forgotten. The Norse afterlife did not reward virtue in the modern sense. It rewarded bravery. A good heart might bring love, but not legacy. A fierce spirit, however, might earn a seat at Odin's table. Funerals reflected this worldview. Bodies were burned or buried with care, but not softly. Weapons, tools, tokens of identity, all were sent with the dead, not because they would be used, but because they told a story. Who you were mattered. How you died mattered more. But being remembered, that was everything. And so, memory became the closest thing to immortality. Stories were armor against oblivion. A warrior forgotten might as well have never lived. A name that lived on the tongue of the next generation, that was power. This belief hardened the Viking soul. If the gods themselves could not escape their fate, then no man needed to feel shame for dying. All that mattered was the posture in which you fell. And in the stories they passed down, one truth remained constant. When Ragnarok came, when the end finally arrived, even the gods would stand. They would not beg, they would not run, they would fight, because the Norse did not believe in eternal life. They believed in earning a good death. Ragnarok was never a warning, it was a certainty. The Norse did not believe the world might end. They believed it would. That the day would come when bonds would break, monsters would rise, and even the heavens would split open under the weight of prophecy. And yet, for all its horror, Ragnarok was not a failure. It was a final act, long rehearsed, deeply known, and faced without denial. The signs would be unmistakable. The sun and moon would vanish, swallowed by wolves who had chased them since the beginning. The great tree Yggdrasil would groan with strain. The dead would march from the underworld, led by Hel herself, while giants would tear across shattered skies. The seas would rise, vomiting forth the serpent who had circled the world, and fire would rain from above. And in the middle of it all, Odin would ride to meet his end. Not to prevent it, not to delay it, but to stand before the monstrous wolf Fenrir, knowing he would be devoured. Thor, the Thunderer, would crush the great serpent but fall moments later from its venom. The gods, for all their power, would fall not in surprise, but in duty. They knew this would happen. They had always known. Ragnarok had been carved into their fate before the first hall was built, before the first man had drawn breath. There was no escape, no negotiation. But there was honor. There was resistance. This belief did not weaken the Norse, it shaped them. If the gods themselves could not avoid ruin, then why should mortals expect a peaceful life? If even divinity bent to fate, then courage wasn't just noble, it was essential. The stories passed from elder to child were not tales of triumph, but of dignity in the face of loss. They were reminders that meaning wasn't found in avoiding death, but in meeting it well. And then, after all the burning, after all the ash, something else. Renewal, not redemption, not paradise, but the soft green breath of a world reborn. The earth would rise again from the sea, cleansed not of memory, but of noise. A few gods would return, not as conquerors, but as survivors. Balder, long dead, would emerge from the shadows. Light would return, but not as a reward, simply as what comes after dark. Two humans, hidden deep in the tree's shelter, would step forward. They were not heroes. They had not battled giants. They had merely endured. Their survival was quiet, unnoticed by the cosmos, but it was enough. From them, life would begin again. And this, more than any prophecy or poem, is what defined Norse belief. That destruction was never the end. That the cycle would turn, not with trumpets, but with breath. That the purpose of the world was not to last, but to matter while it did. Even the gods, those towering figures of storm and wisdom, were not above this truth. They fought, they failed, and they made way for what came next. Their stories did not promise safety. They promised clarity. They showed that permanence is not strength. Endurance is. That glory does not lie in escaping loss, but in walking into it with open eyes and a steady hand. The Norse looked at the world and saw struggle. They looked at the gods and saw reflection. And in their stories, dark, defiant, full of grief and fire, they left us a truth too raw to soften. The world ends. But meaning doesn't. So they carved their runes, raised their stones, told their tales. Not because they believed in victory, but because they believed in being remembered. And somehow, centuries later, they are.